how much of our food is now ultra-processed in the US and UK?
In the UK and the US, on average, more than half of our calories, on average, come from ultra-processed food.
Which is obviously enormous. Brilliant. Tim, do scientists understand how ultra-processed foods damage our health?
We're beginning to.
Can you undo the damage from ultra-processed food if you stop eating it?
Yes.
And finally, can ultra-processed food ever be healthy?
Unlikely.
Never been able to extract any molecule from any whole food and find that it has a benefit in healthy people. So we know that walnuts are good for us, whole grains are good for us, Mediterranean diets are good for us, vegetables are good for us, fruits are good for us. But if you extract the lycopene or the molecules from red wine or the vitamins and you give them to healthy people, they don't have a health benefit. So food as a complex substance is really health-giving and life-giving for all the reasons that your listeners will know. But the individual nutrients are not what make it healthy, or it turns out what make it unhealthy. So when you make a lasagna at home, you can make a salty, fatty, even sugary lasagna, and it will not have the same effect on your physiology or your health or your brain or your risk of heart disease as if you go and buy a very similar sounding and ingredient lasagna from your local supermarket wrapped in plastic.
When we think of junk food, we have this sort of list of ice cream, pizza, fried chicken, cake, that those things are junk. But actually, pizza's a traditional food. If you eat a sourdough pizza covered in mozzarella cheese and tomato sauce with a bit of basil, even a bit of meat on it, it's a perfectly healthy meal. There's nothing bad for you in it. It's the frozen, ultra-processed fake pizza that will drive weight gain.
Hey everyone, in today's video I want to talk a little bit about health. I don't claim to be an expert, but someone asked me, are these new technologies any healthier? And my answer is, it depends. On the line of completely ultra-processed food to whole foods, the first generation of these technologies probably falls somewhere in the middle. We'll get into that a bit later in the video. In the future, these foods from precision fermentation will be built up from simple ingredients, rather than what we have today, which we have ingredients that are broken down from complex ones. We need a lot of processing to get the individual amino acids and proteins that we need from our food. So there's an argument that, well, because we're changing the system from being highly processed, where we're breaking down real foods to make processed ingredients, and instead we're just using precision fermentation to grow those ingredients, that reduces processing and makes it healthier. I don't know. I haven't seen any studies. We're too early to say, I think. But for me, how I think about it is, currently I eat certain processed foods. If I just replace those with a precision fermentation version, I'm not really too concerned. For me, those two things are equal. Now, if we take something like whey protein, for example, it's really just a production system change. So if you use whey protein today, precision fermentation whey protein is going to be the same. In an animal system, when we separate out the whey protein, we dry it. Whereas with precision fermentation, we just grow that protein. So in terms of the actual ingredient replacement, if you're consuming those ingredients today, the precision fermentation ingredient is going to be the same thing. Up until now, it's been better to get your protein from whole foods and a varied diet rather than a supplement, bar, or shake. If you do use a supplement, it's best to look for one that lists whey protein as the only ingredient. Over the long term, if a lot of our food system becomes precision fermentation products or cultivated products, what does that do for our health? I don't know. I think in the short term, we're still too early to know that. If we're replacing these cancer-causing food dyes with some more natural precision fermentation produced dyes, that might be a little bit healthier. Likewise, if we're replacing a lot of the sugar in some of these products with sweet proteins, that might help make things slightly healthier, but you're still eating ultra-processed food.
We started worrying in the 1980s that it was fat that was making us all fat. And so food companies started to replace the fat in lots of their pre-packaged, ultra-processed products with things like gums and starches. They feel fatty in the mouth, they don't deliver so many calories into the body. What happened was we all kept gaining weight. In fact, we started gaining weight faster. In around 2000, we started worrying about sugars. And so we started to replace lots of the sugars in our food with artificial sweeteners. And this has happened now on a very, very wide scale in the UK. What's happened? Absolutely nothing. Our weight hasn't fallen. And in fact, there's very little evidence that replacing the sugar in our food with artificial sweeteners really drives a lot of weight loss. And this is really weird. It should be telling us that we don't understand something about how the body works, that when we replace sugar, which is around 400 calories per 100 grams, with something with 0 calories, it doesn't support weight loss. This is a big clue that we failed to understand something about the way our body takes in food. When we experience a taste in our mouth, it signals to our gut that particular nutrition is on its way. So umami tastes from molecules like glutamate signal that fermented, easily digestible protein and amino acids are on their way into our body. When we have sweet taste, it signals sugar's on the way. When we have fatty taste, it signals fat is on the way. When we replace the sugar, the protein, and the fat with synthetic molecules, we create this mismatch where what we experience in the mouth doesn't signal nutrition that arrives.
Here is an animal ice cream on the left and a precision fermentation ice cream on the right. These are both processed foods. Let's check the ingredients of the precision fermentation. There are a shit ton of ingredients here, but the new ingredient, the precision fermentation ingredient, isn't any less healthy than what we find in this animal version. We have non-animal whey protein base, which is a mixture of water and the non-animal whey protein. And then we have all this other stuff in here. Super long list. So the ingredient is perfectly fine as you would compare it to any other whey protein because it's the same thing. But this is a highly processed food product. Is this food product healthy for you? No. Is this food product healthy for you? It's real cream. It's from an animal. It must be healthy for you, right? Well, no, it's not. It's the same thing. This is a highly processed food product. And we have fresh cream, monoandiglycerides, carb bean gum, cellulose gum, guar gum, carrageenan. I can't even pronounce that. Look, if you can't pronounce an ingredient on a label, it's a highly processed food. Both of these are highly processed foods. Neither of these are healthy for you. So this whole argument that the animal, because it's real cream, is healthier for you than this is just a lie, because they're both highly processed. What if we can get the fat and the protein from precision fermentation? Could that be healthier? What if we can get 100% precision fermentation ice cream? Potentially. And if we can avoid adding a lot of these highly processed ingredients, these gums and these other things that you saw on the real animal ice cream, we could potentially have quite healthy ice cream actually. But we're not there yet. Again, it's important to look at the dairy products like we saw with the ice cream. If they contain a lot of other ingredients, especially ingredients that you can't pronounce, that's more on the ultra processed food spectrum. If we can get like some simple dairy proteins, maybe some casein and whey, maybe a couple other proteins in there, and some precision fermentation dairy fat, potentially that could be equal and as healthy as any standard dairy that doesn't have a lot of extra processing in it. But a lot of dairy does have extra processing in it. So it's really about looking at this scale of whole foods and ultra processed foods that I think is the big question when it comes to health, in my opinion. And that's just going to be the case with any packaged food products. If you're going to eat really any ice cream from the store or a restaurant, these are the kinds of foods you're going to find. So unless you're cooking your own food from scratch, unless you're making every single thing from scratch, unless you know it's a whole food, you're likely going to be eating somewhere in the middle of processed to the ultra processed side. The fewer the ingredients, the better. And some companies are starting what they're calling this clean label thing, which tries to highlight that they're using less processed ingredients. So you can buy these packaged foods that are on the scale of ultra processed to whole foods, are more in the middle or a bit closer to the whole food side.
I'm Chris Van Tulloch, and until I started writing this book and started studying ultra-processed food as a scientist, I'd never read an ingredients list, and almost none of my colleagues who are scientists and doctors had either. The really important thing about reading the ingredients lists is that's how you can tell if a food is ultra-processed. The kind of additives you're going to be looking for is this very wide range of molecules, things like emulsifiers, humectants, stabilizers, gums like xanthan gum or guar gum or locust bean gum. But there's also things that sound a bit harmless, like fruit concentrates or natural flavorings or natural low-calorie sweeteners. All of those are still signs of ultra-processing. And the thing you're worrying about is partly those additives themselves. We know that some of them are harmful. But those are also signs of lots and lots of other processing and design technologies that have gone into the foods that drive excess consumption and health problems.
In this case with pasta, we have one single ingredient in here. Could we replace that ingredient with precision fermentation? In my opinion, the pasta with one ingredient would be the same, whether it has that ingredient from precision fermentation or naturally.
Pasta and pasta. This pasta has been dried for 3-4 hours, very high temperature, 100 plus degrees. This pasta has been dried for 3-4 days, low temperature, nice and cold. The high temperature used to dry the pasta stress the gluten and make it very difficult to digest. Look at this. You can understand this yellow pasta is way processed in industrial way. This is natural. You can understand treat like from an artisanal pasta maker. This al dente says 11 minutes. This al dente said to cook 16 by 18 minutes. Even this, it's a thing to understand the difference between a pasta and a pasta.
In terms of cultivated meat, we don't know for sure. We haven't done any studies on this. It's still really new technology. Now, nutritionist Dr. Dana Hoons from UCLA, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, says that there are potential upsides to cultivated meat, but we still don't know. It's too early. In principle, cultivated meat is almost nutritionally identical to farm or ranch-raised meat. But with cultivated meat, you can adjust the medium in which living cells are grown to add certain vitamins and nutrients that would alter and perhaps improve its nutritional quality. Looking at a list of whole foods, you shouldn't have meat with hormones or antibiotics. Unfortunately, in not every country, but certain countries like the United States, China, large portions of their meat contains antibiotics. In the United States, in particular, 99% of animals are grown on feedlots. And most of the antibiotics, a huge percentage in the United States, are used for that protein. So in that sense, the current food system, if you go buy really any meat, most of the meat you can buy, whether it's restaurants or even supermarkets, contains hormones and antibiotics. So actually, technically, it doesn't really meet the definition of a whole food. What about grass-fed beef? That's one of the solutions that's being talked about as a way to help solve this problem.
And that grazing land produces a very tiny fraction of our food. It's hard to tell exactly how much because so many animals are taken off the grazing land and finished in feedlots towards the end of their lives to fatten them up quickly because they grow slowly on grazing land. But the animals, this doesn't capture the whole of it, but the animals who are grown entirely on grazing land produce just 1% of the world's protein across 26% of the land area. And we're looking at the vast majority of the agricultural land area is used for that grazing. This is a fantastically wasteful land use. This is an extremely profligate way of using the world's most precious resource, which is land. And every hectare that occupies is a hectare which could otherwise have been occupied by a wild ecosystem, by a rainforest, by a savanna, by a natural grassland. And the great majority of the world's species depend on wild ecosystems for their survival. In fact, Earth systems themselves depend on wild ecosystems for their survival. So the worst thing you can possibly do is to take away wild ecosystems on an industrial scale. Now, there was a very interesting paper published a couple of years ago, which said, what would happen if we did what all the Alan Savorys of this world and the celebrity chefs and the food writers and all those other influences told us to do, which is to stop eating feedlot beef and switch to pasture-fed, grass-fed beef instead. And this has become this great foodie thing. You should all be eating grass-fed beef. And now we can all agree we hate feedlot beef, right? It's horrible, it's disgusting, it's appalling. But the only thing worse than feedlot beef is grass-fed beef. And the reason for that is the vast amount of agricultural sprawl it causes. And what this paper found was that if you switched away from feedlot beef to pasture-fed beef, in the United States, the area devoted to keeping cattle would need to rise by 270%. You would need to cut down all the forests. You'd need to drain all the wetlands. You'd need to water all the deserts. You'd need to degazette all the national parks. You'd need to demolish all the cities. And you would still be importing a lot of your beef from Brazil.
So if we're trying to keep costs down, if we're trying to keep meat available, one of the solutions is cultivated meat. And companies are working their hardest to make sure that their meat doesn't contain antibiotics. Will it work? We'll have to see. I would say it can't possibly be worse than most of the current meat you can get. Everyone's crying about how unhealthy it is, how terrible it is for you. Okay, fair enough. But if you're still going to eat fast food, your McDonald's is, your Wendy's, your packaged fish, or your chicken tenders, or your chicken nuggets in the supermarket, or your bologna, or your pepperoni sticks, all of that is just as unhealthy for you as the lab-grown meats of the world. Will it get to the Whole Foods level? I have no idea. We'll have to see. How do these new technologies fit on this spectrum? I've plotted a few examples to give my point of view. This is where I think we are today, and this is where I think the trends are based on the technology and what I've seen people say. So for precision fermentation, it's really about individual ingredients. If we combined all the ingredients and we had the fats, could we get to a minimally processed or unprocessed whole food? Potentially. Cell-cultured milk made from cell-cultured mammary cells, which then give us milk, lands here. Things like 100% pure extra virgin olive oil is pretty minimally processed if you get the high-quality stuff. Natural pastas, like one ingredient and low heat processing, are almost in the group one. Oils that you're going to get mostly fit in the processed food section.
It's an all-purpose cooking oil, so think it's not supposed to be replacing olive oil. It's more for high heat. So the idea behind their mission is to be replacing vegetable oils. So think canola oil, vegetable oil, corn oil.
For most pastas, natural pastas are more healthy for you. Most pastas are going to fall in the processed foods category. Whey protein, so for Perfect Day, their whey protein, it's the same as animal whey protein. That would be a processed culinary ingredient. Cheese, vegan cheese, I believe, would be considered an ultra-processed food. The first generation of precision fermentation milk and cheese products are going to be falling into this category, in my opinion. Eventually, we'll get them to where cheese is today. So cheese today is a processed food. Most ice cream, whether it's precision fermentation or animal ice cream or vegan ice cream, would fall under ultra-processed foods. Now, what about meat? Probably this is quite controversial, but if we look at the definition of a whole food, you shouldn't be eating meat with hormones or antibiotics. Really, only 1% of the meat you can get in countries like the United States and China would fall under this first group. And that would be things like your grass-fed beef, as an example. Most of the meat I'm going to be putting under processed foods. It's factory farmed, it has a lot of antibiotics, and there's just a whole host of issues that you find in this meat. Maybe you put it between group 1 and 2 and 3, but I'm going to argue that it is more processed than not, just given the larger issues surrounding factory farm meat. Now, processed meats, I would put between processed and ultra-processed foods, and then meats like you would find McDonald's, their beef, the Tyson chicken tenders that you would find at the supermarket, these breaded fish that you get in the frozen food section, these types of foods would be ultra processed. So where does cultivated meat come in? In my opinion, the 100% cell cultured meat. So like you find from Upside Foods that is serving at Bar Cren in San Francisco, this would qualify, in my opinion, as unprocessed or minimally processed foods in line with this grass-fed beef. Other companies like Good Meat, which use 70% cultured cells and 30% plant-based ingredients, in my opinion, would fall under this processed foods category here. So in the short to medium term, are these technologies going to make us healthier? They're not really going to change much. We're still eating processed foods and ultra processed foods. In the larger sense of food system changes, how that affects our land use, how it affects things like antibiotic use, we're not going to get massive E. coli outbreaks, salmonella outbreaks. We don't get factory farms being located right next to where we grow our vegetables, and so the water doesn't get contaminated from cow shit and then is irrigated. So as we move towards this system over time, I think we will get healthier. In the short to medium term, I don't think it's going to do very much for our health. In the medium to long term, though, there are massive implications, especially if the technology pans out as hoped. Thanks as always for watching. We'll catch you in the next video.